Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's In Conversation live with Artemis Cooper. I'd like to remind you all that these sessions are highly interactive, and the more they are, the more fun they are, because the interview just takes all sorts of avenues that we weren't expecting. So I really urge you to get writing in the chat if there's anything you want to know about Artemis, about her books, about the subjects of her books, or anything else indeed. So Artemis Cooper is the author of several biographies, historical books, and edited collections of letters. Welcome, Artemis. Hello.
Hello. Hi.
Hello. We've got
Very pleasure to be here.
welcome, and we have an enormous number of people who are so keen to hear us chat away. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to focus initially on the famous Duff Cooper Book Prize. Later we'll talk about your life and the books and everything else, but I'd love to hear something about the story of how this book prize started, and also what's it about and who's winning it?
Well, the book prize began in 1956 and it's been going ever since, and I've run it for about the last 30 years or so. And it was set up after my grandfather's death. I never actually met him. He died when I was a year old. And it was set up by some friends of his, and they passed around the hat, and they got some money together to endow a prize for non-fiction, basically. And so it's been going, as I say, ever since, been awarded ever since. And recent winners that we've had include Anne Applebaum for her study of the Gulag, Christopher de Hamel, who wrote a fabulous book called Meetings with Remarkable Manuscripts. And our most recent winner is Mark Mazawa for his history of the Greek Revolution.
And how does it happen? Do you have how do you choose your judges, and where do you meet? Are these literary figures who come together, or historical ones?
Well, there are 5 judges, of whom I'm one, and the warden of New College is another. And then the other ones, they serve for 5 years as a judge, and then they appoint their own successors. So it's a kind of apostolic succession, really, again, going since 1956. And we meet up usually over dinner and some champagne, because I find that really helps with the judging. And we meet up, usually Antony and I give a dinner, and we talk over the books, and then we have dinner, and then we talk some more. And then we do the actual judging takes place after 2 sessions of judging. And then we do what's called a border vote, which is basically, let's say we've got 10 books on the shortlist. We give 10 marks to the book we like most and 9 to the next one, and so on and so forth. And it's proved to be a very good system, I have to say. And I think one reason why this prize, so I'm told, has a cachet within the publishing industry is that actually over the years, there have been very few duds.
And I'm just thinking of the recent Booker Prize. Well, first of all, we know that sometimes they are quite heated, the discussions. And also recently there was that moment when, 2 people were awarded a prize. Anything like that happened to you at this particular book prize?
Not really, because I think it's small enough and easily managed enough so that actually, if there were some situation, like, for example, 2 books coming out on top, we would discuss and we would get to a point where one person has it, because I think what I would do is say there can only be one winner, because otherwise, if there are 2, that dilutes the whole thing. And the Booker, of course, is on a much larger scale. So if they have 2 winners, that's actually a big newspaper story.
Yeah.
But for us, I would always rather make the evening and make the win about one person and focus on that one person who's won and their achievement.
Beautiful. And so if I remember correctly, you said that basically your father passed it on to you
Yes.
as a job. How did that feel, just out of interest? We'll talk about your dad in a minute. But
Well,
was it something you had a choice in, or was it like you'd be told to do this?
not really. And I was about 8.5 months pregnant. And he said, right, I've done this long enough. It's your turn now. And so basically, I said, well, all right, thrown in the deep end. Actually, I must have been right at the beginning of the pregnancy, but certainly by the time I came to give the talk, I could hardly get close to the microphone. But it went very well, and I really enjoyed doing it. And the first winner was Peter Hennessy's Never Again, which is a study of the immediate post-war Attlee government and the creation of the welfare state. And so I felt, actually, although it had nothing to do with it, because it's a process among the judges, but I was very, very proud of that. I enjoyed the fact that we had given it to a book that I had really enjoyed myself, and I enjoyed all the other ones too, but I was particularly behind this one.
That's a beautiful story. We'll move on to talking about your dad in a minute. Gerard McMahon says, hi, Artemis, what do you know of Paddy Leigh Fermor's connection with Ireland? Thanks for an interesting lecture.
Right, his connection with Ireland. Right, okay. So he always used to say that he had Irish blood, and I'm sure that was definitely true through his mother's side of the family. And he always wanted to join the Irish Guards. But when he joined up at the beginning of the Second World War and went through the basic training. But when he was sort of earmarked for the Irish Guards, but when the time came, he needed a salary, and the Irish Guards didn't have any opening for him. And so he joined the intelligence regiment instead, the intelligence corps, which was in fact a far better use, I think, of his talents. And even more so when you think that his final report on finishing basic training, the commanding officer said, this man will never make a good regimental officer, but the army may find some use for his considerable talents.
Excellent. That's such a brilliant answer. We'll come on. We have a lot on Paddy Leigh Fermor as we carry on the evening, but certainly if anyone else has any questions about him, do put them in. So your father was John Julius Norwich, and of course, right. Every time I think of him, I think of Christmas crackers, because I think of Christmas and I think of all his collections. Yes. So a diplomat, a writer who has influenced you in so many ways. Tell us about him, give us an idea of his life. It will be a real privilege to hear you speak about him for a bit.
Yeah, he was just wonderful, and I absolutely adored him. And he was a wonderful, a rather distant father, I suppose, in a way, but whenever he saw me, he made a big fuss of me, and he was one of those life-enhancing people that, when they come into a room, suddenly the sun shines and everybody feels happier. So he was like that, and he was a wonderful and very inspiring father. I remember him coming back from a long trip that he did in the mid-1960s he went to the Sahara at a time when people didn't do it that often, and it had been a big adventure. And he came back, and I'd been looking forward to it for weeks, and then I couldn't believe it. He'd grown a beard, and I'd never seen him with a beard before, so that was quite an eye-opener. And then as I grew older, it was great. He was always enormously encouraging and enthusiastic about everything I wanted to do, and of course he was in so many other lives. And whether it was saving Venice or saving the Paddington Waterworks or Waterways Society, or he was involved in so much, the British Theatre Museum, and of course the wonderful Christmas crackers. And that became like a wonderful sort of how is it, a kind of informal club. There wasn't a membership, but people were always suggesting things to him and he would include them. And it felt so good if one of your entries made it into the cracker.
And so for how many years was he running the Christmas crackers, actually? I mean, obviously now we've got collected volumes of them, people can get them, etc. But how was it throughout your life, would you say? Or
well, not quite throughout my life. I mean, I think his first one was in 1972.
Yeah.
And then and he'd sent them out just as a kind of glorified Christmas card, really. But he had always kept Commonplace books. And they were beautiful books. They were bound in Morocco leather, each one a different colour, by Sangorski and Sutcliffe, who were then the great binders. And they were about sort of, slightly smaller than A4. And he had beautiful handwriting, and all the pieces that he'd collected were inscribed into these books.
Oh, right. So they were objects of beauty. And
extreme objects of extreme beauty, both because of the writing and because of the quality of the paper. And he thought, well, here's, some people buy Sèvres porcelain, and that costs a lot. Whereas the stuff that I'm collecting doesn't usually cost anything at all. So I'm going to spend money on, as it were, the cabinet. Yeah. And so there were these beautiful books, and they also acted as a great quality control, because he had a rule that every entry, even though it was only 2 lines long, had to go on a fresh piece of paper. And if your pen at that moment balked, then you knew it probably wasn't good enough.
Not good enough. Excellent. Did he have ideas about your future? Was he a father who was already, say, advanced in terms of the equality in terms of gender and the future? Did you feel supported in looking for a future for you?
I always felt supported, but I don't think he didn't really think about me getting a career. I don't think I was going to probably more like have a series of jobs until I got married. I think he thought in those terms, which wasn't so unusual. He was delighted when I went to Oxford. He was delighted when I, continued and, did VSO, travelled around, did whatever. He was always, always supportive. But I think he was somebody with a very, very busy life. And so as long as he thought I was getting on all right and happy, I don't honestly think that he gave it too much thought.
Let's move on to your mum for a moment, because she's very artistic. She was a painter.
She was.
And do you have paintings in the house that she did?
I do. I'm looking at one above my desk right now. A really beautiful. This particular one is a painting on glass, and I can try and take it down. And did you want to see it? But
is it easy? If it's easy, yes, I think we should absolutely do that.
Might be difficult. That's her.
Oh wow, that's fantastic.
This is on glass.
Such a beautiful
watercolor painting. Behind.
Yeah. So growing up, did you have lots of memories of her actually being at the easel painting?
Oh gosh, yes, very much so. And also, of course, I was very often roped in, voluntold basically, to be her model. Oh. So we were always being drawn. Well, not always, but when she felt like it, she would say, "Oh, hold it right there," and she would go get a pencil and paper and draw you. And so that was well, it was up to a point fun. It was nice with the results, but it was boring when she said, left ear up a bit, shoulder down a bit, and things like that the whole time. But basically, she painted much more sort of, she painted abstract paintings, a bit like the ones. They were very much influenced by her travels, what she'd read, things like that. But I think she was wonderful because she truly plowed her own furrow, did what she wanted. Mm-hmm. And I think if I had any idea, any kind of benchmark of what it is to be an artist, I think of her.
Now, one more member of your family and someone who really influenced your career eventually, in the sense that you were your grandmother, Lady Diana Cooper. Talk
Yes.
to us a bit, and how, in a way, you know, that your literary career was your writing career might have been influenced by the fact that one of your books was about the letters. So yeah, talk to us about that.
Yeah, well, that was in fact my first book was an edition of the letters between her and my grandfather, and that came about because Philip Ziegler was writing her biography, and then when that had happened, I was actually not around, and so he asked me to write a letter about her, which I did, and he liked that very much. And then he was also at that stage a director of Collins, and he asked me to do this collection of letters. And it was wonderful because actually I simply hadn't ever known my grandfather, who wrote terribly, wonderfully funny and amusing love letters. And indeed hers back. And they corresponded all their lives. I mean, there was a large chunk of time when she was an actor, and she was in this play by Max Reinhardt called The Miracle. And that ran for about 6 years in America, a huge success. And she played the part of the Madonna. And anyway, so that was her gone for 6 months a year for 6 years. And so therefore they wrote continuously to each other during that time.
How did you feel? I'm sorry to interrupt. When you were reading them, did you feel that you were somehow prying into the personal side of their life, being part of the family? It's sort of more, it's more involved than being an outsider to the family, when, you know, people's secrets, people's personal stories get uncovered. How did that work?
Well, you see, my grandmother was still alive then, and she was very happy I was doing this. And she really enjoyed going over all these letters. And there was one in particular that she'd written that I was really felt, this is very, very personal indeed. And she had written to my grandfather. He was about to come back from the First World War. And she was writing to him about, they were already engaged, and she was writing to him about how much she was longing to be married to him and making love to him for the first time. And I said, this is really very personal. And I handed her the letter. And she said, oh, I haven't got my glasses. You'll have to read it out. So I had to read out my grandmother's thing about losing her virginity to my grandfather. Not that she'd done it yet, she sort of was imagining it. And my grandmother listened to all this and then said, well, I think that's absolutely beautiful. Of course you must publish it.
Oh, that's so fantastic. How old was she? How old was she at the time?
She was, I suppose, in her 90s by then.
Yeah.
It wasn't long before she died. Well, no, actually, I think the book came out in 93. Yes, so she still had 2 or 3 years to live. But yeah, she was very old, and she enjoyed it.
That's beautiful. And do you get a sense of the family through those letters, of the life they would build together and what happened? Is there a narrative there that you can pick up about your own? Yeah.
Well, not so much about my own life, but about the nature of theirs. And they had, you know, it was largely dominated by the First and the Second World Wars. And my grandfather won the DSO in the First World War and managed to come back alive. In fact, I think he was almost the only one of all those young men that she would have known and gone to parties with and danced with who did come back alive. Yeah. And they were married, and then he goes into Parliament, and he does that because you needed money to do that. And that was why she was acting in The Miracle. So then there's that period of her life where she's in America, he's here, he's beginning his political career. And then, of course, the Second World War, when he has a ministerial role, and they're much more together then. So there isn't quite so much in terms of letters. But there are one or two. And then there's the, journeys and things like that. So you definitely get the span of their entire lives. And when there were times when they were together, I would put together sort of short linking passages. So I did. I became very, very familiar with both their lives in that way.
And it set you up really in that literary life that you then pursued.
Yeah, absolutely, it did. It did.
And we'll go on to all the other things. Michael Kenworthy Brown says, are your father's Commonplace books in the public domain? And do explain if you, for some people who may not.
My father's Commonplace books are not actually, you mean the handwritten ones? The handwritten ones, this is it?
I don't really know. Michael, you might want to add something to the chat, or but yes, what about these books that have been written?
The handwritten ones are with my stepmother.
Oh, right.
And there's, I can't remember how many volumes. I think there's about 12, 13 volumes.
Presumably he knew that they would end up eventually somewhere public. I
imagine
by the time he was so successful.
Yes, I imagine that they will, though. I mean, a lot of his papers have already gone to Churchill College, Cambridge. I'm not actually sure of what the plans are, but yes, I imagine that they will be in the public domain somewhere.
Yes, Michael says, yes, he was talking about the handwritten ones. Yes, because we're quite curious now, having collected the little ones, to see the originals will be a real pleasure. Now, let's go back to you now. And I am conscious of the fact that we're going to spend a lot of time in this hour talking about other people and, you through other people. But that's, I guess that's a choice of life, that you delve into into humanity through these. You're afraid. But you've had a very colourful life. Initially in England, but Beirut at the age of 5. Why don't you remember a bit of? You and I have spoken, and it was very evocative what you told me. So, what were those years like? You were there for 3 years, I think. Or?
I was there for 3 years. Well, my father was in the diplomatic service at that stage, and he was still the sort of lowest form of diplomatic life, I think, probably third secretary or something like that. And he was posted to Beirut and took my mother and myself, and I was 5. And we had the most beautiful house, which was on a hill, and it was on the first floor, and there was a staircase going up outside that you had to climb to get into it. And you came into this enormous room. Well, I thought it was enormous because I was very small, so it's probably not quite that big. But it had the most beautiful arched windows, and then a terrace, covered terrace, and then a view of the whole of the bay going up to the mountains of Lebanon and as was then, the cedar trees on the mountain. And it was completely beautiful, and I recognized how beautiful it was. And it was the heat, the smells, the dust, the pleasure of being in the Middle East, I really loved. And
even though you were so little, you still remember being in the right place.
I remember the streets. I remember, being taken by my nanny and the cook, who was called Mohammed, and they would sometimes go shopping or something, and I'd tag along, and and there it was. And it wasn't until, well, I loved it at the time, and I remembered these wonderful tastes and smells. And it wasn't really until I was back in Egypt after Oxford that it all came back with a bang, because of course that was, you had all the great sort of sacks full of spices and things like that all over the place, and tiny little bakeries where people were pulling flatbreads out of the oven. And so it all came back, and I've always had a tremendous taste for the Middle East ever since.
And do you think you ended up in Egypt with a VSO because of those early experiences? Was there a drive to return to
No,
some
again, they just
faraway
said that's where
land?
you're going. So that was that.
Right, you were assigned. You were told you were going.
Yeah, I was assigned. So
Yeah.
I was assigned to teach at the University of Alexandria. So I was in Alexandria for what, a year and a half, 2 years.
Yeah.
And that was another wonderful experience. I adored it. But Lebanon remains. I've never been back, but my daughter has. But it was one of those places where I think I'd never lived in such a colourful, redolent, noisy place.
It's interesting you haven't been back. I mean, with all the traveling you've done, it's interesting that is it almost preserving the almost special memories that are linked to the family, those particular times?
I think it's probably that. It's a kind of, cowardice, I suppose. But I have never, I think if somebody, what would be there now? I mean, it would be so different. I know our house doesn't exist anymore. I think, funnily enough, the school I was sent to a French school, the Collège Protestant pour Jeunes Filles in Beirut was where I learned French. And I remember that very vividly too. And I think that still exists because actually I have a friend, and she showed me some photographs one day of the school, and that's still exactly as I remembered it.
So the return. So when you were 8 and you came back to England, having loved that atmosphere in Beirut, how was that return, and how did you settle back in?
Well, I think it was difficult. I missed Beirut a lot, and I was sent because my parents thought, well, she picked up French very quickly in Lebanon, and she's going to forget it that fast if we don't sort of hammer it in a bit. So I was sent to the French lycée, and it sure did, hammer it in. But I wasn't particularly happy there, and then my parents sent me to a convent school, the Convent of the Sacred Heart in Woldingham, and I've never quite worked out why they did that, but that's what they did. I was very happy there, and then my mother, who at that stage was an atheist and a socialist, found out we were having masses said for Mr. Macmillan to win the general election. She was so poor, she took me away, and I ended up in Camden School for Girls in North London, which was also lovely. But it was actually quite a culture shock going from the convent to Camden.
I can imagine. Now, thank you for sharing all of that. I'm going to jump a few steps and move to Patrick Leigh Fermor's involvement in relation to your life, because you actually spent a lot of time with him, and I remember a beautiful piece, and I might have it here, that you wrote about visiting from an article you wrote. So I might read a little bit of this, saying that you remember being daunted when you first went to Cardamili, to his house in 1984, and you were going to interview him about a book you were writing, and you were absolutely stunned by the door opening onto this sea setting, the terrace from the house, and you spoke about his incredible ease and the way he was so good at entertaining, and his presence. Again, you talk about your father having a presence, and it feels again like this man obviously was a bon viveur in many ways. And before you tell us about it, I found a lovely quote. A journalist once called him a cross between Indiana Jones, James Bond, and Graham Greene, and I thought that was I don't know what you think of that, but yes. So how did it happen that you ended up knowing Paddy Leigh Fermor?
Well, he had been a friend of my grandmother's, And they had met during the war, just after the war. And then, and they adored each other. Paddy and my grandmother absolutely adored each other. And he was often at her house in France, which was near Chantilly. And he used to come and stay there. And in fact, I think there's a letter of his to Deborah Devonshire, which actually describes me in my pram looking like a Cox's orange pippin. And so obviously I was a very healthy baby. And so I'd known him, you know, he drifted in and out of my life always. And then when my grandmother moved back to England, and he was always backwards and forwards there, and he became a friend of my father's, whom he'd known almost at the same time. My father used to say that it was Paddy who gave him his passion for the Mediterranean. They went on a cruise, and I can't exactly remember when, I think it was in the late 50s, in a yacht belonging to Stavros Niarchos, who had lent it to my grandmother, his second best yacht. It was called the Eros. And Paddy was invited by my grandmother to sort of show us around the Mediterranean. You set the journey, you do it. And my father said it was absolutely magical because, you know, he learned so much about the Mediterranean and about, I think they were in the Cyclades and all those islands. And Paddy was just a fund of knowledge, and hugely entertaining too. So there was that connection. And then after I'd written my grandparents' letters to each other, I wrote a book about Cairo in the Second World War. And in fact, it was not my idea. It was my friend Hugo Vickers, who was at that stage writing about Cecil Beaton. And I said, how's it going? And he said, I've got to when Cecil is in Cairo. And it's absolutely extraordinary. Everybody you've ever heard of was there during the war. And it's absolutely amazing. And I said, well, that's great. You've got your next subject. And he said, oh God, I can't face it. Why don't you do it? So that's how the idea came to me. And I thought, well, I knew Paddy had been there because, of course, for him, Egypt was the launch pad to Crete when he went back as a member of SOE to help with the Cretan resistance. So he had been there. So that was my first time when I went in 1984. It was to interview him for that book.
That original book about
That's
Cairo,
right.
with the idea that was provided for you. How lovely. So little did you know that life would bring you together at a later date in such a personal way. So, and was he helpful to you when you went that first time?
He was fantastic. That first time, he was wonderful. He opened up his entire address book. He really helped me enormously. And indeed, so did his wife, Joan. And they were both full of memories of Cairo and put me in touch with all sorts of people. So it couldn't have been better. They could not have been more helpful and kind.
And so if I try to take a step forward then, how did it happen that you ended up writing his biography? Because first of all, it wasn't published until after his death. I'm aware that he didn't want that to happen whilst he was still alive, but it was a process, wasn't it, in terms of deciding who would write it and how long it took. So
yeah, well what happened next was, after I'd finished the Cairo book, I married Antony Beevor, the historian of war, as he likes to put it, in 1986. And soon after that, he was commissioned to write a book about Crete, the battle and the resistance. And of course, he was going to, and we got in touch with Paddy, who knew Antony by now and liked him very much. And of course, and again, this wonderful generosity, Paddy put Antony in touch with a great many people in Crete and was hugely helpful. and made a very, very big contribution to that book. I mean, went through it in the editing stages, as did Zan Fielding. And so all that went very well. And they were both Paddy and Zan Fielding, who was his best friend, who'd also known Crete incredibly well. They were very pleased with Antony's book. They thought that it had really done justice to the Cretans. So fine, that's all very nice. And then Antony thinks, well, I got a proper pat on the head for that. So why don't I suggest to Paddy that I write his biography? So he did exactly that. And he wrote.
Did he do that in person, by the way? Did he go to art? When someone says to someone, can I write your biography?
No, it was a letter.
It was done by letter, yeah.
It was done by letter. These are still the days before emails, and actually, Paddy never had a computer. He had an electric typewriter, and that was the devil's work as far as he was concerned. So he never really progressed much further. Yeah. So no, this was done in a letter, and off it went. And Paddy's not usually the most reliable of correspondents, so Antony was never expecting, anything by return of post. But there was just a thundering silence. There was nothing. And quite obviously, Paddy was not in the mood and hated the idea of a biography. In fact, he always did. And I think he felt very much like Oscar Wilde, that it added a new terror to death. And that, he would do everything he possibly could to avoid it. So anyway, time moves on, and Antony then begins his work on his first great bestseller, which was Stalingrad. And then comes a strange moment when Paddy's wife, Joan, is sitting next to Antony at a dinner party and says, when are you going to write Pad's biography then? And Antony said, well, I thought he didn't want it written. And Joan said, well, yes, he doesn't, but, I think it would be a good idea. And his publisher also thought so. And anyway, to cut a long story short, Antony suggested me. And I think actually Paddy was happier with the idea of my doing it. I think he always felt rather, it was kind of too, I don't know, particularly another man who never missed a deadline, unlike him. It would have been too much for Paddy. And in fact, it was quite a work for me to get through to him. And
get through to him, meaning to make him sit down and answer your questions enough in order to have material for the book, you mean?
Yes,
or get through to the man, to the core of the man?
Well, both really, because I always felt that he was deflecting me with a torrent of dazzling conversation and anything he could think of. And whenever I tried to ask him about his childhood or about his Cretan friends, everything was sort of rosy coloured, and, it was quite obvious that the edit button was on in his head big time. And I wasn't getting anything that he wouldn't have told the average journalist.
That's interesting, and you knew this because you could read some censoring going on in the way he behaved.
Yes, it was just like the sort of stuff. It wasn't telling me anything that I needed. It wasn't giving me a real picture. It was giving me almost sort of the version that he wanted to see, but it wasn't real. I knew it wasn't real. And I knew that he was hiding quite a lot from me. And I had no idea how I was going to get through, particularly as at that stage, our children were quite young, and I couldn't afford to take great chunks of time off and immerse myself in Cairo. I'd go there to his house for 2 weeks at a stretch, or something like that.
How often? 2 weeks at a stretch? Would you have gone twice a year or more?
Something like that, yes, usually twice a year.
Yeah.
But I really wasn't getting what I needed. And he was also very, what's the word, protective of, I mean, he worked in a study with all his papers around him. He kept, you know, he kept an awful lot of letters and things like that. But he was very, very defensive, and I didn't know how I was ever going to break through. And I talked about this with his publisher, and his publisher said, well, how about we do a sort of interim book, which we did, which was called Words of Mercury, which was kind of greatest hits by Patrick Leigh Fermor. So we put that together. And a few things began to count, and he was obviously feeling a bit more relaxed. And then his wife died. Joan died in, when did she die? 2003, I think it was. And that left him absolutely bereft. And there came a point when, again, I was going to have to come out and be with him, but this time without Joan. And I was very nervous of what was going to happen, what it was going to be like without her to sort of, you know, jolly things along.
Yeah.
You know. And anyway, it was during that time, and by now he was in his 90s, and it was during that time that he said to me, Artemis, I'm in absolute despair, because he also his sight was going. And he said, I'm in complete despair because my study is such a mess. And I can't see anything. I can't read, I can't write, I can't work, I can't do anything. And I said, well, would you like me to help you tidy it up? And he said, gosh, that's a wonderful idea. Would you really? And I said, yes, of course, lovely. Why not? And so I sat in his study, which was quite a big room. I sat at a round table at one end with piles and piles of paper that were all over the place. You know, I mean, some were letters, some were articles, some were learned journals, some were, you know, bits of manuscript that had got out of sync and things like that. Anyway, this was the open sesame, because he sat at his desk pretending to work on the famous third volume. And I was able to just gently go through the papers and put them in order. And when I had a question, and very often I would read something that he'd written and it was funny, and I'd start laughing, and he'd say, oh, what have you got there? And I would say, oh, well, this is a letter that you were writing to Henrietta Bowden-Jones, and you're talking about this. And I didn't know you knew her, by the way. And then suddenly it was a sort of conversation about friends, and we could get in tangentially.
Yes.
And that's what I needed.
Yes.
And then suddenly things began to flow much more easily.
That's fascinating. And do you feel that, having made that breakthrough at this late age of, you know, he was 90, as you say, do you feel you saw a side of him, but maybe not any other side? I'm thinking of the man in Crete who dressed up as did he dress up as a shepherd to help the intelligence? And you must tell us that story. I think listeners would enjoy that. But, you know, we are hearing about this 90-year-old, slightly fumbly old man who's bereaved, sitting there opening up to you. And yet there's a direct opposite to this, who is this
incredibly dashing, very good looking man who is often in Cretan disguise. Although when he was in Cretan disguise, he had shut up, because although he could speak Greek very fluently, it was still with a heavy English accent, which wouldn't have gone down terribly well. So whenever he had to take a bus or be in a public place, he had to be with a Cretan who said, sorry about this guy, he's got a screw loose and he's my cousin and I'm just taking him to the doctor, or something like that, you know. So Paddy was the half-wit cousin who was sort of taken on buses when he had to use a bus. Otherwise, they were walking over the mountains, you know.
But he was a man of great courage. I mean, this was 1944. He took risks. He was, he led the party that evacuated the German commander. I mean, these are
when he went back into occupied Crete for the first time as an SOE agent, at this point he was in Heraklion, and not in the mountains, but in the town, trying to find out what had happened to people. And he would sometimes actually, see a German soldier with a cigarette fumbling for a light and deliberately go up to him with a match. That was his idea of fun.
Gosh, can I just say one thing then that might be interesting to you? Of course, you know it, interesting to the listeners. His last report from the King's School in Canterbury noted that the young Leigh Fermor was a dangerous mixture of sophistication and recklessness. And to me, what you've just recounted is exactly an illustration of that.
That's right, it is. He was always extremely reckless. And this was why, in a way, he had to, coming back to the early part of his life when he walked across Europe. But he was always in danger, whether it was at school or in the army. The set that he would have been in, whether was the naughty set, okay? The ones who were spending too much money and drinking too much and driving the fast cars. He was always attracted to those guys.
Well, he got expelled, didn't he? Didn't he get expelled for holding a girl's hand? Or
yes, he did.
Probably worse than that. Otherwise, he probably wouldn't
he
get
was
expelled.
Well, it was a sort of custodial offence practically at that stage, certainly at the King's School, Canterbury. But I mean, to tell you the truth, that was the straw that broke the camel's back. I mean, he was always getting caught, going, and he put some money at the bookies, or he was caught in the pub or on the cathedral roof, or wherever it was always him who was in trouble. And then finally he like many others, I think, but they were just cleverer. Everybody had a bit of a crush on Nellie Lamar, who was the greengrocer's daughter in Dover Street, and he was caught holding her hand by the proctors or whoever they were, and that was the sacking offence. Yes, exactly.
Now, I'm aware of the time, and we're enjoying this so much that I want to make sure we fit in a few things. Now, some of us were very, very lucky to end up in Kardamili at the beautiful Greek festival that Tom Holland and many others, Bethany Hughes and many others were speaking at this summer. And of course, the house that Paddy Leigh Fermor inhabited has been fully restored by the Benaki Museum, to whom it was left, from what I understand. Now, they told us when we were in this beautiful place with all his original books in the very well preserved, that when they inherited the house, it was a disaster, and it was full of mold, and it was falling apart, etc. Is that right? Was it slightly sort of abandoned? I mean, I would imagine it would be easy to abandon it. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, it does look very, very smart now. The thing is that I think when you've lived in a house, I mean, when that house was built, there was no electricity in the Mani. So, all the plumbing, it was built in the late 60s, and the plumbing and the electrics came in later, as it were. So they were never terribly successful. They'd been tacked on. Every single lamp in the house had a sort of trailing flex, which had been slightly gnawed by the mice, trailing to the wall. And it had a beautiful, I think it was Nancy Mitford who described, she said, all the most beautiful rooms in the world are a little bit shabby. And this house was a bit shabby. And it was also staggeringly beautiful.
Beautiful.
And, but at the same time, I think the Benaki have done the most amazing job. They have put in air conditioning, heating. I mean, Paddy had terrible old electric heaters that probably, real planet destroyers sort of going off during the winter. And he did have an open fireplace too, which smoked like anything. It was a copy of a Persian fireplace, but it never had enough back to it. And so it smoked like crazy. And so it is now far, far more comfortable than it ever was. But at the same time, they've done it with such restraint. So, for example, the whole of it, it's properly insulated for the first time in its life. It was rather full of rats, quite a lot too. You could hear them thundering. Paddy would say things like, "Oh, there's the rats moving their pianos around again," this sort of awful noise in the roof. But so they took all that down, they got rid of the rats, they insulated it properly, they took off all the beautiful old tiles, put proper insulation underneath them, put them all back again. So it has been done to a very, very serious conservation level.
How will it feel for you to be back this summer? Because you are going back. You are going this summer. You've been back, but the idea of being there for the festival, for the Benaki Literary Festival, will it? How does it feel? Are there ghosts for you there? There
are ghosts, but at the same time, there are some ghosts, but not many. I mean, the house had to change. Things have to change. And of course, it's not the same as it was when Paddy and Joan were there. At the same time, some things that I'd forgotten, like, for example, they've restored the terrace. I always thought there were these sort of, or at least for the most of the time I've seen it, they were just grey pebbles. I suddenly realised they're actually red, white, grey, black pebbles. The whole thing's been cleaned off and now just glows. So in some ways, some things have got better. And that view never changes. And that light is so beautiful. And I can still sit out on the little terrace where I used to have breakfast sometimes, and we always used to have dinner. And it's still exactly the same.
Yeah. Beautiful.
The cushions are slightly more comfortable.
I have just some questions about the work you've been doing in terms of writing people's biographies, and of course you've written several others. But do you feel? Now I'm asking, I suppose, as a psychiatrist, but do you feel that one has to dig deep into the darker side of human nature in terms of your characters that you choose? I mean, no one's perfect. Do you kind of need to really get in there, or is it more about just getting to the essence of their humanity? What makes a good biography, I suppose?
I think, well, what makes a good biography? I think you have to immerse yourself in that person, and you usually find out from talking to other people that they had their faults, sure enough, and they were not perfect. But I think that you've got to reveal the true side of them, that they weren't always perfect. But at the same time, I think it is still the biographer's duty to present the case for the defense. And so you don't have to condone everything they did. You have to I think what you have to do is tell the story and let people make up their own minds. So I remember I was once, this was quite early on, the biography had just come out, and somebody came up to me and said, well, I've read your book, and I don't think I like Paddy Leigh Fermor. I think he was a sponger and a womanizer. And I was actually pretty indignant at that. And at the same time, I thought, well, this is your vision. I've also given this, I think I wrote about extraordinary spiritual generosity, the way he could be with all sorts of people and really give himself to them in such ways that, this is a very one-sided thing, but this is what you have taken from the book. It's just your reading of it.
Is it possible to write a good biography about someone one doesn't like?
I expect it is. I've never had to do that. I think there is always something. There's always something, I think, heroic about a life at all. People do have difficulties. They go through bad stuff. They see their friends and family die, whatever it is, and you have to find that. I mean, if you really think this person is, why are you writing their biography in the first place? You must think there's something, there must be some reason that attracted you in the first place. So I've never written a biography of Adolf Hitler, for example, or Stalin. I don't think it's my sort of book, but I don't think if you were going to write a book about a historically important, truly ghastly person, you wouldn't do it in the way that I'm writing it.
Yes, I understand. Now, my daughter, who was watching me prepare for your interview, said, well, why don't you ask her who she would like to write her biography? And I thought, well, that's probably the best question of the night. You know, thank you very much, Francesca. Yes.
Golly. Oh, well, that came out of left field. No mistake. I can't begin to think.
Well, you don't have to
I don't think it's really, I'm not really worth it apart from anything else.
Anyway, it's just a thought, you know, just a thought, but
no,
an interesting question, isn't it?
Again, I suddenly find myself like Oscar Wilde. It's adding a new terror to death.
So another thing, and again, I've been mulling on the idea of writing about others, only because I suppose, or maybe even more so, because we as psychiatrists spend all our time listening to stories of people's lives and never are able to really write it out publicly or talk about it. So it's the opposite in a way. But what's the most surprising or unexpected fact that you've uncovered? Have you got any anecdotes for us? We are about to finish soon, but it was really to know whether you had any stories for us.
I do, but I think sort of perhaps one of the most extraordinary ones was, and I'm not even, was to find out that Patrick Leigh Fermor, the first love of his life was this Romanian princess called Balázsa Cantacuzene. And I had, there was a collection of her letters in a drawer. And these were letters that she had written. Just to put this in context a bit, he had spent the 4 years before the Second World War with her in Romania and traveling around Europe. And then the moment war is declared, he rushes back to England to join up. And in that moment, she says, I knew then that it was over between us and I probably wasn't ever going to see you again. Anyway, so then for her, of course, things get pretty grim. Because Romania and the Balkans are overrun. And then, of course, comes communism. And then after the war, she is separated from Paddy and indeed all her friends. She had many friends the other side of the Iron Curtain, but there she was stuck. Anyway, so, and she was forced, she and her family were thrown off their country estate, and they were put into, sort of given a home in this little attic in Pucioasa, which is a little town outside Bucharest. And she writes to Paddy, I think, out of just a misery, you know, just describing things. And at one point she tried to escape, and she gets together the money with great difficulty and tries to escape with a cousin of hers. And almost immediately they are caught, and she's interned, not for very long, a couple of weeks, but it's quite bad enough to be in a Romanian communist prison, you know, and he's the same, and then they go back. But anyway, so there are these letters describing this part of her life. And I said, oh God, it's so exciting, Paddy. I found these letters in this drawer. And he said, oh, wonderful. Let's read them out after dinner. You must read them to me. And I assumed, of course, that he had already read them. And I begin on the one which describes how she had tried to escape and how she was caught. And I suddenly looked up, and he'd gone as white as a sheet. And he said, I have never heard this story before. And I could hardly believe it. And perhaps and I thought, you know, because again, has he forgotten that he'd read it? Or had she literally just, and I think what must have happened is that she'd given him this great pile of letters, because he did come to see her in 1965 when things were better. And she'd given him this great pile of letters. And I think he just put them away and probably never read them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a heartbreaking story and so incredible. Well, everyone will be reading your book now after tonight if they
Oh,
haven't
thank
already,
you.
so we can catch up on it all. Artemis, we are going to finish on asking you what you're working on next.
I am working on a cultural history of Paris, which is going to go from, I think, 1789, big revolution, to 1968, another big revolution, with lots of other revolutions and things in between. But it's basically the story of Paris and the extraordinary, whether it's painting or literature or poetry or music, this extraordinary creative hub that was Paris. So it's
Looking
about
forward
that.
to it. Looking forward to it very much and hearing more about it. Now, I've had messages coming through on my phones also saying thank you very much for this great evening. And Dr. Addy is also saying thank you very much. And if you stay with us for a second, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. Thank you to Matt on the tech support. Again, if people would like to donate to the RSM, we're always very grateful. These events are free and we welcome any educational donations. We have two great future events for ICL. As you know, they've become less frequent. On the 29th of June, we have Professor Gillian Leng with Professor Yvonne Doyle. And on the 20th of July, our president, Roger Kirby, will be in conversation with Sir William Russell. So I'm going to thank Artemis again for being so entertaining and really, really enjoyable to speak with you tonight. And I'll wish you all a very good evening and a good dinner later. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thanks very much indeed.
Bye-bye.